Hello and welcome to Oak Grove Film and Media. In today's video, we're going to be discussing David Gauntlett's theory of identity. So, without further ado, let's get right into it. David Gauntlett's theory answers two questions. Number one, how does the media we consume today influence identity? And how has media representations changed over time? So how has representations of specific identities changed over time? First, let's talk about how the media actually influences our identity. When we consume media, it doesn't just tell us about who we are, but also tells us about how we should be as well. Especially this occurs a lot with repeated representations as well. So for example, let's take a common representation of gender. If I, as a woman, I'm always seeing women represented in a way whereby they're wearing makeup, they're wearing jewelry, perhaps as well they are always wearing high heels, they're sitting with their legs crossed, they're not belching. I, as a woman, as I consistently see that representation, it's also going to affect how I behave because I, therefore, see that's what women should be like, and therefore I would feel a need to replicate that. So Gauntlett's theory is the idea that the media we consume shapes our identity, and it tells us not only who we are, but how we should be as well. So that's one part of Gauntlett's theory, the idea that the media we consume influences and shapes our identity. But, lucky for us, there's a second part as well. Part two of the theory focuses more on representations over the course of time. Gauntlett states that older media products provided very simplistic and very 2D representations, stereotypical representations of reality, especially focused on gender representations as well. These representations were often entrenched in the stereotypes. However, Gauntlett argues that representations now are a lot more diverse, they're a lot more complex, they're a lot more challenging in terms of what they used to be, let's say, 50 years ago. He said there is no longer a clear-cut representation of what something is or what something is not. Representations are now rich in complexity. For example, the dominant representation of, let's say, men about 50 years ago would have been that they are the strong, stoic breadwinners. In contrast, we had women who would have been the weaker, emotional homemakers. Whereas now, these stereotypes definitely do still exist. It's more so now the fact that there is a variety of other representations that are provided rather than just these 2D stereotypes that we used to get. Another example of representation that changed over time would be race. Let's take black men, for example. The stereotype or the stereotypical representation that would have been created and repeated multiple times in the media beforehand would have been representations linked to crime or other delinquent behaviour. Whereas now, according to Gauntlett, because representations are becoming more challenging, more complex, you may not always find representation of black men linking to that stereotypical behaviour of it being urban and crime-ridden and so forth. There are now going to be more complex, more challenging, more diverse representation of black men as opposed to just the negative ones we may have seen about 50 years ago. So Gauntlett states that this gives the audience an opportunity to shape their identity more, to express their identity more, rather than feeling limited to being or replicating behaviour of one particular representation. However, this is not to say that we don't still have these dominant stereotypical representations of gender, of race, of sexuality. These stereotypes do still definitely exist. Gauntlett simply says that as time progresses, these representations are becoming more challenging and more diverse. Great, now let's apply the theory. Let's have a look at these two front pages. One from the right-wing broadsheet, The Times, and one from the left-wing broadsheet, The Guardian. How can we apply Gauntlett's theory here? Consider as well where the theory may be being subverted. I advise you pause the video here and see where examples of the theory can be found. Right, let's have a go. On the Times front page, you could argue that Gauntlett's theory is being slightly subverted, as we do have quite straightforward representation, specifically of gender. In the banner, we have a story about Mary Berry's best cake recipes, something stereotypically feminine, and another story in the bottom of a woman cooking, again, stereotypically feminine. Furthermore, in the banner, we have a story of a woman focusing on how her husband used to be hot, with the phrase wife tales underneath. This reinforces the representation of women as mere wives and who's only focused on their husband and their kids. It's also stripping away their individual identity and focusing on them as partners, sort of additions or sidekicks, rather than having their own individual strong identity. Again, we have straightforward representations of men as well. We have ideas of power and influence as being suggested in the main image of the soldier kneeling in front of Zelensky. Also, again, we have the man in the banner, who we can presume is the husband that the woman is talking about. He looks very stoic. He looks very disinterested in what's being discussed. Perhaps, again, linking to the idea that this conversation or this topic to him is futile, as discussions of relationships and love and partners is something that's more stereotypically feminine. These representations can lead to women thinking that they, like Mary Berry, should know how to bake great cakes, or it can lead to the representation of men now thinking that they too need to be as powerful, as influential as Zelensky, or they too need to be as stoic or as disinterested. The Guardian's front page, on the other hand, is a very strong example of Gauntlett's suggestion of identity and representation of identity changing over time. The main image is of David Bowie, a male singer who was renowned for his distinctive fashion style. This eccentric clothing and the makeup that he has is not something you would stereotypically see on the man. However, this image of Bowie clearly demonstrates how representation, particularly of gender, are fluid and they are changing and they're adapting over time. Further, above the masthead, we see an off-lead story of Tracy Ann Oberman playing the lead role of Shylock in Shakespeare's play Merchant of Venice. So Shylock in Shakespeare's play is a male, but here in this story we have a woman playing a male role. The fact that this story is not talking or is not exacerbating the fact that, or highlighting the fact that she's a woman, she's playing a man's role, the fact that they're not seeing that as something strange or eccentric or different, really reinforce the fact that these representations are changing over time. The representation of women are changing over time. It's seen acceptable for her to do or have such an important role as Shylock does in the play. Furthermore, as well, in the text, you can see how it says she is willing to, or she's more so not going to shy away from, and she's going to embrace the villainy of Shylock. Like, while, yes, she is just playing a role, but the representation of villains and women is not something we often see in the media. So the fact that we see this representation go in a contrast against the stereotypical representations of women being kind, caring and nurturing really reinforces and supports Gauntlett's idea, the fact that representation of gender is changing over time. Amazing. We've now applied Gauntlett's theory of identity. If you were studying OCI, doing A-level media studies, when it comes to your paper 1, your media messages paper, question 4 is going to be an evaluative question. This means you're going to get a choice between 2 theories and you need to evaluate one of those theories. When it comes to evaluating the theory, you now need to consider how is this theory useful in helping me understand about these newspaper front pages, these newspaper articles about the newspaper industry, what does it tell me about the producers and so forth. So you now need to consider how this theory is useful in helping us understand newspapers and how it is also limited. So let's evaluate Gauntlett's theory of identity. So this theory is useful in a few ways. Number 1, it's widely applicable to a wide range of media products. This means that theory likely has a lot of validity and it's helpful in helping us understand different elements of the media industry. Second, this theory is helpful because it applies to newspapers that cater to specific readers. They offer readers an identity. So as we know, newspapers are very much linked to one's identity. So whether you are left-wing or right-wing can influence the paper you read. The culture in which you grew up and the culture in which you live can influence the newspaper you read. Whether you are into more celebrity stories versus international stories can influence the newspapers that you read. Suella Braverman even once said this.
I'm afraid, Madam Deputy Speaker, it's the Labour Party, it's the Lib Dems, it's the coalition of chaos, it's the Guardian reading, tofu creating wokerati, dare I say, the anti-growth.
Furthermore, this theory is useful because it applies to a variety of different newspaper sections and how they sometimes offer contradictory messages, therefore showing how they're trying to target different types of identity or different identities. However, this theory is quite limited in a number of ways. Number one, many people do not associate or do not use newspapers to reinforce any aspects of their identity, especially younger audiences. For some young audiences, newspapers are now actually redundant to the point where they don't read them at all. Newspapers and online newspapers too. Many young people nowadays, as we know, get their news from online social media or on other online sources. For example, today was the day that Jay Slater, the young man who's been missing in Tenerife, where some human remains were found. And I personally found that out via Instagram before I actually read it on BBC News. So for many people, newspapers, online newspapers, are no longer an influential aspect of their identity as it once was. So Gauntlett's theory isn't necessarily very well applicable here in this modern age. Another limitation of the theory is that it assumes that audiences are active and powerful agents in the media industry. This theory is limited in the sense that it does not take into account, or it does not fully take into account, the power of conglomerates to shape these representations and therefore change the audience rather than it being the other way around. So rather than it being society changing, and then that's why these media representations are changing, maybe it's actually these media moguls, these media barons, these oligarchs that are changing the representations themselves. Who influenced who? Did the producers influence the audience, or did the audience influence the producers to create these representations? And that is it. Thank you so much for tuning in to another video from Oak Grove Film and Media. I hope it was very useful to you. And if it was, please do not forget to like, share, and subscribe. See you next time.